In 1959, the bulldozers moved into Black Bottom. They came with legal authority, federal funding, and a plan that had been years in development inside the offices of the Detroit Housing Commission and the City Plan Commission. The homes they cleared had been occupied the week before. The businesses along Hastings Street had been opened the month before. The churches, the barbershops, the law offices, the medical practices, the restaurants that had fed shift workers coming off the auto plant lines, all of it was in the path of what the city called urban renewal, and what the residents being displaced called something else entirely. Within a decade, one of the most economically concentrated black districts in America would be gone. The land it occupied would be covered by Interstate 375, the Chrysler Freeway, and the institutional footprint of a medical complex. The community that had been there would be scattered across Detroit's east side in ways that broke the commercial and social density that had taken 40 years to build. Thousands of residents were displaced. The real estate holdings accumulated by black property owners across 2 generations were acquired through eminent domain at values that did not reflect what those properties had been worth inside the functioning economy of the neighborhood. The commercial corridor was not relocated. It was erased. How did one of the most economically concentrated black districts in America get dismantled in less than a decade? The answer requires going back to the moment when none of it existed, when Detroit's black population was small, its South Side neighborhoods were not yet formed, and the auto industry had not yet become the engine that would build and then hollow out everything that followed. Detroit's black population in 1910 was approximately 6,000 people. By 1920, it had grown to more than 40,000. By 1940, it exceeded 150,000. The force driving that growth was the same force driving black migration to Chicago, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Industrial wages in a northern city compared to agricultural wages in the southern states that most migrants were leaving behind. Ford, General Motors, Packard, Dodge, and Chrysler employed black workers in numbers that no southern employer matched, and the wages those workers earned were real wages, cash income that could be saved, spent, and invested in ways that sharecropping never permitted. The migrants who arrived in Detroit between 1910 and 1940 needed somewhere to live. The answer that the city's residential geography provided was Black Bottom, a neighborhood on the lower east side of the city that had been home to earlier waves of immigrant workers, had aged past the point where white residents wanted to remain, and was available to black buyers and renters at a time when virtually nowhere else in the city was. Restrictive covenants written into property deeds across Detroit's residential neighborhoods made it legally impermissible for white property owners to sell or rent to black buyers or tenants. The Detroit Real Estate Board enforced these covenants as professional standards. Federal Housing Administration guidelines, formalized in the 1930s, explicitly directed mortgage lenders away from neighborhoods with black populations, which meant that black home buyers seeking mortgages backed by the Federal Housing Administration were restricted to the corridors where they were already permitted to live. The result was compression. Black Detroit, regardless of income level, regardless of professional status, regardless of whether a family could afford a house anywhere else in the city, was confined to a defined geographic zone. The physician who trained at a northern medical school practiced in Black Bottom because his patients were there and because the hospitals of white Detroit did not offer him staff privileges. The attorney worked on Hastings Street because his clients were there. The entrepreneur who opened a restaurant, a dry cleaning business, or a printing house put it where the customers were concentrated, in the same neighborhood where everyone was concentrated, Black Bottom, and the adjacent entertainment district known as Paradise Valley. Segregation compressed Black Detroit into one corridor. That compression created both wealth and vulnerability. The wealth was real. Hastings Street, the commercial spine running through the district, was a functioning commercial corridor with Black-owned businesses across virtually every retail and service category. Grocers, pharmacists, tailors, funeral directors, insurance agents, physicians, dentists, and attorneys maintained practices and storefronts along a strip that served a captive market of hundreds of thousands of people. Paradise Valley, immediately north of Black Bottom, was the entertainment district, home to clubs and theaters that drew Black audiences who were excluded from the white entertainment venues of downtown Detroit, and who made the Valley one of the most active nightlife districts in the Midwest. The clubs that operated there hosted national performers who could not stay in white Detroit hotels and who performed in Paradise Valley by necessity as much as by choice. The real estate that housed all of this activity had value, and Black property owners had accumulated it. Families who had arrived in the 1910s and the 20s and purchased homes or commercial buildings in Black Bottom had, by the 1940s, built equity through 2 decades of ownership in a market where demand consistently exceeded available supply. The artificial constraint of covenants ensured that the Black housing market remained tight, regardless of what the broader Detroit real estate market was doing. A property in Black Bottom might have been physically modest, but it was in demand in ways that a comparable property in a white neighborhood with declining population might not have been. Black property owners were not building wealth at the scale of the automotive executives in Grosse Pointe, but they were building it, and they were building it in the only place they were permitted to. The neighborhood was thriving, but the city had already labeled it blighted. The designation of Black Bottom as a blighted area was not an accident or a neutral assessment. It was the product of a planning framework that defined blight partly through physical condition, which was real in some blocks where landlords had neglected properties and infrastructure investment had been withheld, and partly through the racial and economic composition of the neighborhood's residents. That combination is how a functioning commercial district with hundreds of active businesses and a stable residential population came to be classified as a candidate for clearance. The Detroit Housing Commission and the City Plan Commission had been developing plans for the redevelopment of Black Bottom as early as the 1940s. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 provided the funding mechanism that would allow those plans to be executed. The Housing Act of 1949 authorized federal funding for what it called slum clearance and urban redevelopment. Cities could apply for federal grants to acquire land in designated blighted areas, clear the structures on it, and make it available for redevelopment. The definition of blight, the boundaries of the clearance areas, and the determination of what would replace the cleared land were decisions made by local planning authorities operating within federal guidelines. In Detroit, those decisions designated Black Bottom for clearance and routed the Chrysler Freeway, formerly Interstate 375, directly through the neighborhood's residential and commercial core. The construction of Interstate 375 and the Chrysler Freeway in the 1950s was not a decision made in isolation from the residential geography of the neighborhoods it entered. Highway engineers and city planners worked with knowledge of what neighborhoods the proposed routes would cross. And in Detroit, as in Chicago, as in Atlanta, as in every major American city where this process played out, the routes that were selected for urban interstate construction passed through Black neighborhoods at a rate that reflected the political and legal vulnerability of those communities rather than engineering necessity. White residential neighborhoods with organized political representation and access to legal challenge mechanisms were routed around. Black neighborhoods whose residents had been systematically excluded from the political and legal infrastructure that might have contested the routing decisions received the highway. The demolition that followed was comprehensive. Black Bottom as a residential neighborhood was cleared. The homes of thousands of families were acquired through eminent domain at prices determined by city assessors rather than through market transactions, which meant that property owners received what the city decided their property was worth rather than what a willing buyer in a functioning market would have paid. For property owners who had spent decades accumulating equity in a market that had rewarded patience with appreciation, the eminent domain settlements frequently did not reflect the value of what was taken. The Hastings Street commercial corridor did not survive the clearance. The businesses that had operated along it for decades were not offered relocation assistance that allowed them to reconstitute elsewhere as functioning enterprises. A restaurant that had built a customer base over 15 years in a specific location does not automatically transfer that customer base to a new location in a different neighborhood, particularly when the customer base itself is being dispersed through displacement. The barbershops and pharmacies and law offices that had served Black Bottom did not find equivalent commercial density in the areas where their displaced customers went, because the displacement scattered rather than relocated the population. Black Bottom's commercial ecosystem depended on the concentration that segregation had created, and when the concentration was broken by displacement, the ecosystem did not move. It dissolved. This was not decay. It was redesign. The city that emerged from the clearance of Black Bottom was a city with a freeway corridor where a neighborhood had been, a medical complex on land that had been residential, and a population dispersed into East Side neighborhoods that were themselves subject to the same dynamics of infrastructure neglect and redlining that had shaped Black Bottom's physical decline. The Black residents who had been displaced did not move into neighborhoods with more resources. They moved into neighborhoods with the same structural disadvantages, now without the commercial density that had made Black Bottom function as an economic district rather than merely a residential zone. Detroit in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a city in which the formal legal architecture of segregation was being challenged but not yet dismantled, in which Black workers in the auto industry were beginning to gain stronger footholds in unionized positions but remained concentrated in the hardest and lowest paid production work, and in which the political representation of Black Detroit was growing but had not yet reached the level that would have allowed it to contest the planning decisions that were reshaping the city's geography. The combination of displacement from Black Bottom, continued residential segregation in the neighborhoods that absorbed the displaced population, and systematic denial of mortgage access through Federal Housing Administration redlining in the areas of the city where property appreciation was occurring meant that the equity lost through eminent domain in the 1950s was not being rebuilt through comparable property ownership elsewhere. Then came the summer of 1967. In the early hours of July 23rd, Detroit police raided an unlicensed bar on 12th Street, an event of the kind that had occurred before in Black Detroit neighborhoods that were subject to aggressive policing. What followed over the next 5 days was the most destructive uprising in American history to that point. 43 people died. Hundreds were injured. Approximately 2,000 buildings were burned. Property damage ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. The National Guard and federal troops were deployed. The uprising accelerated what policy had already begun. Insurance companies that had been covering Black-owned businesses in Detroit reassessed their exposure and either withdrew coverage or raised premiums to levels that were not economically sustainable for small business operators. Capital that had been circulating in Detroit's Black commercial districts was redirected. White-owned businesses that had operated in mixed commercial areas concluded that the risk of remaining exceeded whatever returns the location had offered. The business departures that had been gradual through the 1950s and the early 1960s became rapid after 1967. The auto industry, which had been the economic foundation of Detroit's Black working class since the Great Migration, began its own restructuring in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. Automation reduced the number of production workers the plants required. Competition from foreign manufacturers reduced the profitability that had sustained the industry's wage structure. Plants were moved to suburban locations or to other states where labor costs were lower. Each of these shifts reduced the number of unionized manufacturing jobs available to Black Detroit workers who had built their economic position on auto wages. And the reduction in auto employment produced a reduction in the purchasing power that had sustained the commercial districts of Black Detroit's East Side neighborhoods. What the bulldozers of 1959 had not finished, the insurance withdrawals of 1967, and the deindustrialization of the 1970s completed. The independent commercial district that had concentrated Black economic activity on Hastings Street and in Paradise Valley was gone. The real estate control that Black property owners had built across 2 generations had been acquired at below-market values through eminent domain, or had lost its economic significance as the population base that supported it was dispersed. The institutional continuity of Black Bottom, the medical practices and law offices and business relationships that had accumulated social capital as well as financial capital over decades, was broken by displacement and could not be reconstituted in a scattered residential pattern. The generational wealth transfer that might have followed was interrupted at precisely the moment when it should have been occurring. The families who had accumulated property in Black Bottom in the 1930s and the 1940s were reaching the age when that property would normally have passed to the next generation. What passed instead were eminent domain settlements that did not fully compensate for what had been taken, and displacement into neighborhoods that offered fewer opportunities for comparable accumulation. The political leverage that the concentration of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley had given Detroit's Black civic leadership was reduced as that concentration was broken and as the community's economic base was weakened by the loss of its commercial district and the decline of its primary industry. Detroit's Black elite were not destroyed by one riot. They were dismantled by policy, infrastructure, and the redirection of capital away from the neighborhoods that had once concentrated it.